Welcome to the IISS this afternoon. My name is Rahul Roy-Chaudhury. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Institute and the head of the South Asia program. This is the first in a new series of IISS discussions on key trends in South Asian security in partnership with the Near East and South Asia Center of the U.S. National Defense University in Washington, D.C. These discussion meetings will now take place at Arundel House every 6 months, following our joint IISS-NISA regional security conferences organized in the Sultanate of Oman and the Kingdom of Bahrain. Our panelists flew in from Oman yesterday, where our joint Track 1.5 conference brought together top government, security, and intelligence officials from the three core countries of Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, along with influential experts from the region. Uniquely, top US government officials also attended and spoke in the conference. We also served to facilitate the resumption after 17 months of the four-nation Track 1 Quadrilateral Cooperation Group meeting on Afghanistan that took place in Oman the day after our conference ended. The opening panel of our Oman conference was the new U.S. strategy on Afghanistan and South Asia, challenges and prospects, the subject of today's discussion session. 8 weeks ago, on 21st August, U.S. President Donald Trump announced his new Afghanistan and South Asia strategy aimed to supply a much-needed, wider regional approach towards the future of Afghanistan. The strategy explicitly identifies Pakistan and India as key players in relation to the stability and security of Afghanistan. In view of the off-the-record nature of our Oman conference, today's discussion session will primarily be based on our individual observations and assessments of the discussions that took place. We will provide a US and regional perspective on the issues, focusing on Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and China. Each of us will make introductory remarks for a maximum of 10 minutes and possibly less, which would be even better. Our first speaker, John Wood, Associate Professor at NISA, will focus on US policy. John.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to commend Rahul Roy-Chaudhury and his IISS colleagues and my NISA colleague Jack Gill on an outstanding South Asia Security Conference just concluded in Muscat. It was a superb collection of serving government officials, former officials, academics, practitioners, and some representatives from the media. So, Rahul, well done. And I once again very much appreciated the opportunity to participate. And thank you also for today's opportunity to address the group here at Arundel House. Let me state up front that my remarks today are my opinion alone, and that they do not imply any endorsement by the United States government, the Department of Defense, our National Defense University, or in fact the Near East South Asia Center. I am compelled to give you that disclaimer up front so that I can speak freely with you here today. So regarding the new U.S. strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia, much has been written, and it was, in fact, a major aspect of our talks in Oman. But I like to remind everyone, and I do this back in Washington as well, to not put all of your stock in what's reported in the press or in the 140 characters of a tweet, but actually to go and look at what the president actually said. And it's easy enough to do. You can go to the White House webpage and actually pull up the verbatim remarks provided by the president on August 21st. I think there are several things that are worth reiterating. Number one, it's worth reiterating that President Trump admitted that his first instinct was to pull out, that is, to leave Afghanistan. But that through the intervention of his policy staff, he was convinced and arrived at three conclusions. One, that the United States must seek an honorable and enduring outcome. Number two, that the consequences of a rapid exit are both predictable and unacceptable. And number three, that security threats we face in Afghanistan and the broader region are immense. He also explicitly stated that Pakistan often gives safe haven to agents of chaos, violence, and terror. He ultimately said that the United States has two enduring interests. Number one, that in Afghanistan and Pakistan, America's interests are clear. Stop the resurgence of safe havens that enable terrorists to threaten America. And secondly, that we must prevent nuclear weapons and materials from coming into the hands of terrorists. Calling it a core pillar, the President said the new strategy is conditions-based, an aspect that has been very largely reported in the press, rather than a time-based strategy. And he said that the second pillar included the integration of all instruments of American power, diplomatic, economic, and military. And the President said, and here I'll quote, he used the word someday, and then he said, quote, perhaps it will be possible to have a political settlement that includes elements of the Taliban in Afghanistan, but nobody knows if or when that will happen, end quote. He highlighted two other pillars. One, change the approach in how to deal with Pakistan, and two, further develop our strategic partnership with India. These last 2 points have perhaps gained the greatest attention and frankly may have been, as I recently heard one senior U.S. official say, over-interpreted. Regarding Pakistan, the President emphasized that Pakistan has much to gain by partnering with the United States and our allies in Afghanistan. And regarding India, the President encouraged India to, quote, help us more, end quote, especially in the area of economic assistance and development, end quote. He did not call upon India to provide military assistance of any kind in Afghanistan. I'm going to say it one more time. President Trump did not call upon India to provide military assistance of any kind. And finally, the President emphasized that Afghans themselves must, here I will quote again, do more. This comment aimed at Afghanistans and Afghans and not Pakistanis, particularly regarding nation building, fighting corruption, and institutional development, saying the American people expect to see real reforms, real progress, and real results. Now, Pakistan's political opposition and the chattering class roundly condemned Mr. Trump's speech and the strategy. But it is worth noting that several aspects of the so-called new strategy are exactly what the Pakistanis themselves have been calling for, namely a recognition of the need for a political settlement, a commitment to a long-term durable presence. In other words, don't abandon Pakistan to hold the bag, as Jack and I have frequently heard, and an increase on pressure on the Taliban in Afghanistan. Of course, a speech laying out a strategy is just a speech. The real challenge now is drawing out the details and then implementing the various tasks. Well, what might some of the new contours look like? Well, some practical measures, adjustments to the rules of engagement, for example, an increased number of U.S. and international troops, the deployment advisors to the conduct level, in other words, the tactical level, increased application of close air support, those kinds of things. But also this new emphasis on a negotiated settlement. And as Rahul had mentioned, we believe that there was some linkage between the discussions in Muscat in the IISS NISA format and the resumption of the QCG on Monday. According to senior U.S. government officials, the contours are shaped by what Secretary Mattis called R4 plus S, as the American bumper sticker seems to be applied to it. R4 plus S. Regionalize, realign, reinforce, reconcile, plus sustain. So what does that mean? Well, not much detail has been laid out publicly. There are some documents available in Washington, but let me give you my interpretation. Regionalize means, of course, not just focused on Afghanistan, but also drawing upon the interest and the influence of India, Pakistan, Iran, China, and Russia. And the United States has a real task here in trying to, and as a former person who formerly worked on the policy side in Washington, the task and the challenge is always to move from a series of, or an accumulation of bilateral approaches and actually have a truly regional integration of all the interests that are there. It's far harder than it probably sounds. But first R, regionalize. Second R, realign. This includes increasing the advisors and the support beyond the corps and brigade level and down to the actual tactical level in Afghanistan, realigning where the emphasis and efforts of the United States and by extension NATO resolute support down to a much lower level. But also pay attention that this is not solely in the military domain. This will be in the emphasis placed on the expectations of the Afghans to continue to deliver greater services and revisions to their government at all levels as well. The third R is reinforce, closely linked with realign. Reinforce means not just an increase of 3,000 or more U.S. troops, but also includes the aforementioned revisions to the rules of engagement, increases in weaponry, increases in the capacity to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, such as the delivery recently of the Black Hawk helicopters and the continued investment of the United States in an indigenous Afghan close air support capacity. And then the final R is reconcile. And here I would say that the emphasis must be on more than just reconciliation with the Taliban. As Secretary Mattis said recently in testimony, he said that this is about moving the fence sitters off the fence. Right? So imagine, if you will, that there's a small group of hardcore Taliban, but there is a large group of people who over the last 40 years of experience have to sit on the fence and need to go ahead and make a decision. Well, this is looked at trying to move them off of the fence. Ultimately, however, success depends on actions Afghans themselves take in which no outside power can impose. The Afghan people, including the Taliban, need to see real reform, a reduction in corruption, functioning credible government institutions, and improving economy and real opportunity. Outside support is needed to bolster the Afghan reforms, but we will simply be squandering resources if the Afghans themselves do not make fundamental changes. The 2018 parliamentary and the 2019 presidential elections are important waypoints, but let's not fool ourselves. Elections do not equal democracy, nor good governance. The Afghan people, the Taliban and the neighbors, Pakistan and Iran in particular, need to be convinced that the country's leaders are committed to reform. Only then will a window of opportunity open for meaningful, broad-based local and regional reconciliation and a pathway to stability. Peace and stability are possible in Afghanistan and broader South Asia, but there remains a decade or more of effort before we can achieve that outcome. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Rahul, and thank you all for attending. I will also make the same disclaimer that John does as well, that these are my remarks and not that of the Defense Department, National Defense University, or the NISA Center. I think you'll quickly find out, and I know this will go the same for Jack, our other colleague, that we do end up speaking our own mind on these. My task has been to do the, okay, so what? What's the regional reaction to the strategy that John outlined, and particularly with Afghanistan, but then also looking at a couple of the other neighbors. As you'll see, we're going to start to walk around the region and see how not just folks are reacting and countries are reacting to the U.S. strategy, but also the current state of affairs, so to speak, in Afghanistan. And again, as noted, as Rahul said earlier, some of this is reflected by the comments that we heard this past weekend, but also our own work and research and travels in and through the region. I would classify these really in three categories, and at best I'll probably get to two of them, but I would say there's optimism, there's skepticism, and there's acceptance. And conveniently, these are divided up amongst some of the countries to the north and to the west, as well as including Afghanistan. I'll refrain from making comments about Pakistan, India, and China, as these will be discussed right after I speak. Now, in terms of optimism, interestingly, and I hope this isn't a surprise for you, this generally emanates from Afghanistan itself. What we generally hear, and what perhaps you have heard as well, is that while this is not a new plan, this is in some ways the specific measures are reflective of U.S. strategies in the past, over the past 16 years, there are certain key elements that do give at least a hint of optimism, or at least some food for thought in terms of how we can move forward. One of these is the very important and critical, whether it's time-bound or not, and the fact that it's conditions-based, not time-based, is definitely seen in a positive light in the region. The notion, and this is an issue that I think will be debated by analysts and strategic studies thinkers for years to come, by creating a time-based or time-bound strategy, did that in fact hurt the broader campaign in the region, or would these other elements have already come into play regardless? A key question, though, that I would say a corollary question that follows up and one to ponder is the fact that this is a conditions-based strategy, is that actually acceptable to the American people? And what you might hear from Afghanistan is, well, this is great for us. Will you accept it? Will there be instances of Americans saying, let's end this conflict, bring people home, regardless of the outcome? Because there is a debate in the U.S. about venturing into foreign wars, and the question of whether we will sustain our engagement, our funding of the effort, is a question raised in Afghanistan. Second issue or concern, second issue that would perhaps warrant some optimism is a heightened engagement with the Afghan National Security Forces. Now, what this really means is the American forces on the ground, and albeit a much smaller number than it was, say, 6 years ago, we're looking at a group that will have an increased, sort of enhanced rules of engagement in Afghanistan. Will this make a difference? Yes. Will there be opportunities to cooperate more closely on the ground, particularly with units that are in combat situations? Absolutely. This was a concern in the past several years amongst Afghan National Security Force leaders. Perhaps this is something that can be addressed with the current policy. Does this put the Taliban on their heels? That's a wait-and-see issue, obviously. We're looking at a strategy that's been verbally expressed less than 2 months ago. To put it into practice as what will happen in the next few months, obviously, we'll have a better read of this perhaps in our 6 months interval, is what impact is this really having on opposition forces in Afghanistan. And in terms of singling out other countries, from the Afghan perspective, again, in some instances, the comments are, well, it's about time that we look at the South Asian, the broader context of the security challenges within Afghanistan to include cross-border issues. Now, there is a moment or a bit of skepticism also coming from Afghanistan. Is it too little, too late? Is this a strategy that now in the 16th, going on 17th year, something that we are outlining, we're highlighting, but at the end of the day, not enough resources will be brought in? The question of no nation building. This has been read in many different ways, and in fact, if you look in the NGO literature, particularly either on the ground or the NGOs and think tanks that work out of DC, and I would argue here in London as well, are we looking at a U.S. strategy that's going to ignore questions of governance, corruption, and others? And the answer, quite frankly, is yes and no. These will still be highlighted, but quite frankly, the desire is to see Afghan problems solved by Afghan participants. The question of an economy that will develop because of private sector investment, that's definitely a wait-and-see strategy, because will private companies come into the country from the West? Right now, the track record isn't so great, and this, I would argue, for the broader region. So what, if we're looking at a strategy that's going to see a more sustained, developed Afghanistan, that's going to require non-state participation, some concern or some grounds for skepticism. I would also argue, and I'll highlight two neighbors that look at the region, Iran and Russia. Iran also shares this skepticism in terms of their concern of the broader U.S. plan. I think it's not an untruth to say that conspiracy theories in the region do tend to be a cottage industry, and we tend to want to link a particular action with some broader plan. And so is U.S. engagement in Afghanistan really about how to contain Iran? Well, quite frankly, it isn't. But can it be interpreted that way in Tehran? It can and has been. Will Iran continue to work both sides? At present, the answer is yes, because they are looking at this strategy as something that's probably not a total game changer, and so they'll want to make sure that regardless of the outcome in Afghanistan, they have a role to play. Now, it's interesting, if you look at perhaps an official interpretation of Iranian strategy, they do look at 4 key elements. The need to bolster the central government in Afghanistan, and that's actually been a fairly consistent strategy out of Tehran. The desire to invest in Afghanistan, particularly in the economic zones in the West, Herat in particular, got it. To avoid direct confrontation with the U.S. and American forces, and I would say broader NATO allies in the country. Generally, that's been held true, and to reduce or stop the flow of narcotics from Afghanistan. That, in fact, is a high security priority from Iran. Quite frankly, the U.S. strategy does nothing to change these 4 broad brushstroke measures. However, when Iran looks at their engagement in Afghanistan and they look at the potential for, again, working both sides, they will hedge their bets. They will work with the official government, but quite frankly, enough evidence is out there that they also have engaged with opposition forces, support for the Taliban. Interestingly, in spite of the anti-Shia rhetoric that the Taliban loves to emphasize. With respect to Russia, and just a final word on this, their view is one, I would say, of acceptance. That is, they understand the U.S. is going to play a role. They understand the U.S. has to remain in Afghanistan for some time. And interestingly enough, from Moscow's perspective, the security threats and challenges coming out of Afghanistan that the U.S. sees and that Russia sees are largely the same. Extremist ideas and support for terrorist groups that could base in ungoverned spaces, narcotics trafficking, etc. How Russia tends to engage on this is quite simple. It's working with the border countries, with Tajikistan in particular. Russian officials have noted on a number of occasions they don't really need to work with Uzbekistan because that's probably the most secure border of the entire broader Afghan region, the Uzbek-Afghan border. And with Turkmenistan, other than a few instances, it's largely been peaceful or remote from the other areas of violence. And so when we look at their view of the region and their view of this strategy, it's one of understanding the U.S. role, but just one last point on this. There is still in the back of this a zero-sum mindset. And so even though the specific strategy may be applauded in certain quarters, the desire to see too much success for the U.S., by definition, might be a limitation of Russian future engagement in the region. And so there is perhaps a bit of concern that we might last a bit longer. So I'm going to keep my comments at that and happy to answer any and all questions when we get to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here at IISS. This is the 11th year of our NISA IISS collaboration, an extraordinarily fruitful cooperation for which I cannot thank IISS enough. It's like my colleagues, I too, although affiliated with the NISA Center, speak on my own behalf. I do not represent in any way U.S. government policy or any institution of the U.S. government in what I'll have to say. And I'll take my comments somewhat to the east and south and talk about Pakistan very briefly and then look forward to your questions. The 21 August speech and the recent events that we've seen demonstrate that the U.S. policy conundrum vis-a-vis Pakistan remains. That is to say, retaining and building relations with an important country when that country is engaged in actions that directly undermine U.S. interests and directly cost U.S. lives, not to mention the lives and limbs of many others. This is not a new problem. And the new strategy that was outlined in August is only the latest effort to produce a satisfactory result, not only from a U.S. government perspective, at least as the U.S. sees it, but as the strategy highlights, one that is mutually beneficial, that is, U.S. and Pakistan, if I can echo my colleague John Wood. So that is to say, the United States sees a benefit to Pakistan in shifting away from support for militancy. It's certainly not for the United States to define Pakistan's national interests.
But rational calculation as an independent analyst would lead one to conclude that militant groups who find a home in Pakistan endanger Pakistan's own internal stability, raise the likelihood of war with neighbors, promote continued instability in Afghanistan, and reduce the appeal of Pakistan as a destination for investment and commerce. These considerations, of course, are above and beyond the menace such groups pose to the larger world, including the United States, as was evident, for example, in the recent BRICS statement in September. Additionally, by perpetuating instability in Afghanistan, such groups make the U.S. military withdrawal from the country much more difficult, even though this outcome is one that's desired not only by the U.S. government, notice the President's comments, but by the American people writ large and by most regional actors. Washington's frustration has been evident in Congress, in the think tank and academic communities, and quietly at least in the executive branch for some years, which helps explain the very tough language in the 21 August speech that outlined the new strategy. Tough language that, to me, is in and of itself an element of that strategy. So the strategy, at least, is intended to clarify U.S. commitment and reduce hedging. While speaking pointedly, the speech also acknowledges Pakistan's losses over the years in fighting its own domestic terrorists. This, too, is not new and has been repeatedly stated by every administration in the U.S. from the highest levels since 2001-2002. Most recently, we've seen effusive U.S. praise, again, from the highest levels, for Pakistan's role in rescuing the Canadian-American couple and their family last week. Certainly a welcome outcome that offers some breathing space, if I can quote a commentator in the U.S., for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Additionally, and again, I think this echoes some of the things you heard from John Wood, although the strategy is often criticized for being too militaristic, it does include a desire and intention to work with Pakistan on a whole range of issues, including Afghanistan. The Quadrilateral Consultative Group meeting just 2 days ago seems indicative of this intention. At the same time, in my view, it is also important to note that the new strategy does not blame Pakistan for all problems in Afghanistan. There's no lack of U.S. self-criticism regarding the involvement in Afghanistan over the past 16 years. And as Secretary Mattis recently said, the new strategy is not anti-Pakistan. Finally, no one in Washington wants to see an important state like Pakistan fail or have problems, continue in difficult directions. Completely the contrary. There's a consistent desire to see Pakistan succeed in achieving peace and prosperity for its own people above all, but to be a regional economic hub, and a commercial hub, and in not to represent a threat to itself or to its neighbors. So allow me to review some of the concerns, however, about the strategy as expressed by Pakistanis, both in our conference recently and during the visits in the past several weeks by Pakistan's foreign and interior ministers to Washington, D.C., and to the U.S., including New York and the UN General Assembly. In the first place, some Pakistanis find truly little that is new in this new U.S. administration's strategy towards the region. Indeed, many Pakistanis see a fumbling United States that is blaming all of its U.S.'s supposed failures in Afghanistan on Pakistan. This is often expressed as scapegoating Pakistan. This is not a new sentiment from Pakistan, has been frequently repeated over the years, but it has been voiced with increased intensity and vigor in the wake of the speech on 21 August. Second, Pakistani observers and officials have frequently complained that the United States does not acknowledge Pakistan's losses, both human and financial, in combating terrorism. This despite, as I mentioned a moment ago, repeated U.S. statements over many years offering exactly such acknowledgement. Third, Pakistanis express deep skepticism about the role the U.S. foresees for India in Afghanistan. We'll hear more about India in just a moment. This, too, is not new from Pakistan, but it has received likewise intensified prominence given the specific mention of India in the 21 August speech. This touches on a key Pakistani security concern, and we'll have to see how it plays out in the future U.S.-Pakistan interactions. Finally, Pakistani reactions to reports of recent drone strikes in eastern Afghanistan raise the prospect that this issue, too, will once again become a point of friction between the United States and Pakistan. It has been diminished in the past several years with the diminishment in the number of drone strikes. That may be changing. We'll see how that, too, plays out. As a last point, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that this strategy is a process. It's a process, not an end point. And so it will develop over time in response to conditions, as opposed to a timeline as was outlined in the speech. So it will doubtless continue, and we will see more specifics emerge in the coming months, I'm sure. So with that, and I hope, Rahul, in keeping well in time, I'll return things to you, and we'll proceed to the next speaker. Thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Jack. It's my turn now, and unlike earlier speakers, I do represent and speak on behalf of the IISS, so you can make that very clear. My remarks will focus on India, and Jack will let me know if I'm about to exceed my time limit. Let me first begin by seeing what India's reaction has been to the new U.S. strategy. Essentially, India has broadly welcomed this strategy for three reasons. Firstly, the continued presence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan that enables India to carry on with its economic and capacity development projects under a U.S. military umbrella. Secondly, no previous U.S. president has talked as tough on Pakistan as Trump has. Thirdly, and for the first time, a U.S. president has publicly invited India to play a larger role in Afghanistan's economic development, thereby legitimizing India's influence in the country. But at the same time, New Delhi also remains wary of the Trump strategy, the US strategy, for two reasons. Firstly, President Trump has expressed concern that tense relations between India and Pakistan, the two nuclear-armed regional powers, could spiral into conflict. India has long opposed this view, which Indian officials regard as implicit in Trump's position, that India's conventional military superiority makes Pakistan's nuclear doctrine of first use against Indian forces legitimate and serves to internationalize their bilateral dispute over Kashmir. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's subsequent remarks appear to reinforce this assessment when he indicated that India should take some steps towards rapprochement to improve the stability within Pakistan, though an official U.S. spokesman was quick to elaborate that this remark referred only to encouraging a bilateral India-Pakistan dialogue and was not linked to a push for a resolution of the Kashmir dispute. The second concern that India has is that it remains bewildered and troubled by Trump's perceived threat of trade repercussions should India not deliver sufficient economic aid and development for Afghanistan. The apparent additional pressure on India to meet U.S. expectations seems gratuitous. Furthermore, India's capacity for increasing economic support to Afghanistan remains limited, given that the two countries are not geographically contiguous and India cannot, for political and security reasons, transit trade through Pakistan. Let me just set this in the context, firstly, of India's relations with Pakistan, and secondly, of India's relations with Afghanistan. In terms of Pakistan, India-Pakistan ties remain tense, with incessant firing across the line of control and the international border, concern over another major cross-border terror attack in India, the absence of any official-level talks between the two countries, and sharp mutual rhetoric and accusations and counter-accusations. As a result, in Afghanistan, New Delhi remains concerned over terror attacks against its nationals following the first major car bombing against the Indian embassy in Kabul in July 2008 and subsequent attacks. The possibility of Pakistan engineering a political solution to Afghanistan's conflict, in which Taliban hardliners may play a part in any future peace process or enter a government, is also of concern to India. However, on 21st September, Prime Minister Abbasi of Pakistan stated that Pakistan was not against an Indian economic role there, but would not accept any political or military role for India. This position was based on Pakistan's concerns that any Indian influence in Afghanistan aimed to strategically encircle Pakistan. Let me look briefly at India-Afghanistan relations and what are India's primary objectives in Afghanistan. Essentially, India's interests in Afghanistan are predominantly strategic, to prevent the return of hardline Taliban rule and the establishment of anti-India terror camps in the country, as well as developmental, to build Afghan capacities in infrastructure and human resource development to strengthen governance. India is already the largest regional bilateral donor to Afghanistan, having committed some $3 billion in aid to its development and capacity building. India also has a defense relationship with Afghanistan. It currently trains Afghan troops and police in India and has provided 8 attack helicopters to Afghanistan. So in conclusion, what are the consequences for India of the Trump strategy? It is still early days of the Trump strategy, as we've heard by the last few panelists. But essentially, my sense is that the new US strategy provides an opportunity for India to build upon its ruthlessly pragmatic neighborhood policy and intensify its strategic cooperation with Afghanistan. As a consequence, there has already been a flurry of Indian diplomatic activity following this new US strategy. The two countries' bilateral ministerial level Strategic Partnership Council met in New Delhi on 11th of September after a 5-year hiatus. Both countries agreed to embark on a new development partnership, cooperating on projects including on the construction of the Shatu Dam in the Kabul River Basin and a polyclinic in northern Mazar-e-Sharif. On the 26th of September, US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis made the Trump administration's first cabinet-level visit to India, meeting Indian Minister of Defense Nirmala Sitharaman in New Delhi to discuss broader defense cooperation as well as strategy for Afghanistan. India-US security cooperation is also to be strengthened through India's enhanced training and equipping of Afghan security forces in India. But as it was made very clear, India has emphasized that it will not send troops to Afghanistan. At the end of September, an India-Afghanistan trade and investment show sponsored by the US Agency for International Development took place in Delhi. And 2 days ago, India's powerful National Security Advisor Ajit Doval flew to Kabul for meetings with his counterpart and Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. I think there are two key issues that we need to keep in mind as the impact of the Trump strategy starts as becoming more apparent. Firstly, for India, although the US has expressly encouraged India to engage economically in Afghanistan, Washington views some Indian initiatives to do so as inimical to US interests due to ongoing strategic tensions between the United States and Iran. In order to enhance commercial links with Afghanistan, for instance, India is investing in the Iranian port of Chabahar and has built a 218-kilometer highway linking Zaranj on the Iranian border to Dalaram in southwest Afghanistan, which in turn connects to important Afghan cities. But the Chabahar project faces delays, considerable delays, over concerns in New Delhi about the Trump administration's attitude towards Iran. And secondly, India supports Afghanistan's quest for peace and reconciliation, of which there is no doubt. But India will seek to reiterate the preconditions for reconciliation. India is unlikely to accept reconciliation without a real commitment from the Taliban to renounce violence, end its links with terrorist groups, and abide by the Afghan constitution. It will be concerned, therefore, with any dilution of these red lines as preconditions or as outcomes. I think these are two key issues for us to look at very closely in the next few weeks and months. Thank you. Could I invite Antoine Levesques now to speak on China?
Thank you, Rahul, and good afternoon to you all. Speaking for the IISS as an observer of South Asian affairs in a Southern Asia context, I'd like to turn to a brief overview of China, the last of the 5 countries under our consideration today. The big news in China today is the start of the 19th Party National Congress, the outcome of which will shape China's top leadership into the next 5 to 10 years, and obviously China's Afghanistan and Greater Southern Asia engagements. But my purpose today is really to narrow the focus on how China relates to the US strategy so far. China was not mentioned in the US strategy, despite the mention by my colleague earlier of the R4+S, including the first word regionalize framework. A single passing mention by name would have reflected the reality of China's stakeholding in Afghanistan, but it was clearly unrealistic, in my view, to expect any detailed prescription on the part of the US for China's role in Afghanistan. This neither fits the spirit or the letter of the US-China relationship today, and more so in 2017 than ever before. It would have caused needless concern in India, the very friend President Trump's speech was keen to relate to, as Rahul explained. But China considers itself and is considered a key stakeholder in the current and future situation in Afghanistan. China has its own interests in Afghanistan, which are unlikely to disappear soon. These are well known and include concern over any terrorism spillover into Xinjiang via the Wakhan corridor, avoiding that ground realities in Afghanistan destabilize countries where China is keen to implement the Belt and Road Initiative, Thirdly, protection of Chinese economic investments against major liabilities in Afghanistan. Fourthly, I believe maintaining and, if possible, growing a so far circumscribed and circumscribable area of bilateral relations with the US. And fifth, perhaps, according to the Global Times at least, preventing US forces from forming a bridgehead into Central Asia. Correspondingly, on 29th of September, China told the UN the focus ought to be on 1. Maintaining peace and stability, including continuing to support the capacity of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. 2. Political dialogue. 3. Strengthening governance. And 4. Integration into regional development. These elements all explain why China has not, in the past year, changed the broad framing of its engagement with South Asia. In Chinese statements, that engagement is driven as much, if not more, by China's approach to Afghanistan in a regional context, rather than China's long-standing bilateral relationship with Pakistan. In other words, China will explain that its Pakistan policy is at least as much driven by its concerns over the situation in Afghanistan than it is by considerations of its bilateral friendship with Pakistan and the opportunities this brings. China appreciates that the US strategy does not raise expectations about its role in Afghanistan. Besides its conditions-based conditions, the strategy does not impose on China. Rather, China can choose to do more of the same or change elements of its so far lower risk, lower opportunity involvement with Afghanistan. This is helpful for a country which rejects being seen as part of a so-called new great game. Pakistan and to a lesser extent Afghanistan have both been keen for China to be more involved in Afghanistan's situation for now well over a year. These calls were part, in some measure, of balancing considerations in respect to the US, as well as genuine demand for involvement of their largest common neighbour, which doubles as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. China's ability to relate independently to the Taliban and to potentially mobilize economic resources, only second to that of the US, are close second-rate considerations for both countries, in my view. There is no evidence to suggest Afghanistan and Pakistan were either surprised or disappointed that China's role was not mentioned in the US strategy. China has had misgivings with the pressure the US strategy puts on Pakistan in relation to its influence over the situation in Afghanistan. China's public reassurances to its Pakistani ally in the late August and early September were unambiguous. It seems to be both the intention of China and the expectation of Pakistan that China's recent statements of support for Pakistan's counterterrorism policies be the baseline for how others should look at China-Pakistan in the context of the new US strategy. Particularly, both sides now underplay the significance of the inclusion of specific names of Pakistan-based groups in Article 48 of the 4th of September BRICS Summit Declaration, as Jack mentioned. That inclusion had resulted in a sense of mild backlash, I think, from Islamabad onto Beijing. This setting straight of the record could well put to rest speculation both inside and outside the region that China is ready to put more pressure on Pakistan to act against militants using its soil. After all, given the added US pressure on Pakistan, perhaps it would not be in the interest of China to add to this pressure on its own if it stood to benefit from any byproduct of US originating pressure without risking antagonizing Pakistan bilaterally. The latest result of those dynamics has, of course, been China's participation last Monday in the sixth round of QCG meetings. So what is the outlook for the next 6 months to a year on China and the new US strategy? My own sense is that China will be keen to play a more proactive role in South Asia, led foremost by considerations related to Afghanistan and close second-order considerations of upkeep and economic expansion of bilateral relations with Pakistan, including the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Once the Party Congress is over, China will fully turn its attention to making a success of hosting President Trump next month. Amidst changes to the ways the US and China raise and discuss issues between themselves, China will look favorably at preserving space within their bilateral so-called diplomatic and security dialogue to discuss South Asia, including Afghanistan. But as of today, I do not expect a sea change in US-China engagement about Afghanistan at that leaders' summit. There seems to be an expectation in China that the US president will seek tangible wins on bigger questions of international security, starting with North Korea. I would point out, however, that pre-existing alignments between US and Afghanistan could help produce an easy win. Beyond the summit, quite what will shape a more proactive engagement by China on Afghanistan is still somewhat unclear. Much of the focus in Beijing will be on the trilateral foreign ministers meeting with Afghanistan and Pakistan within this year, said a statement. A 7th QCG meeting with the Taliban, since China, Afghanistan and Pakistan supported the idea of bringing the Taliban in on the 25th of June 2017. Other points of focus for Beijing will be restricted and/or enlarged regional talks under the respective umbrellas of the Quadrilateral Coordination and Cooperation Mechanism, QCCM, which includes China, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Tajikistan, or else the 6+1 format, US, Pakistan, China, India, Russia, Iran and Afghanistan. I would also look to the next Shanghai Cooperation Organization annual summit in June 2018, which will take place under Chinese presidency, including also the participation as full members of India and Pakistan. I would also look at the revived SCO Afghanistan contact group, which held last week in Moscow a resumption meeting. Like many others, China can be expected to watch for signs of improvement or degradation of the security situation in Afghanistan in the context of any prospective reconciliation talks. There is no doubt in my mind that these conditions would strongly shape any Chinese posture, be it changed or unchanged, in the coming months. So in conclusion, we can expect China to take a more proactive role in Afghanistan in the months to come, diplomatically foremost, and maybe beyond. But this posture will be conditioned by security developments in the countries, details within or any evolutions of the US strategy framework, and finally conditioned on China's political will to take greater risks, including on seeking a greater role in reconciliation. Afghanistan will meanwhile remain at most a secondary consideration in China's broader foreign and security policy making. With this, I end. I look forward to any questions you may have. I look forward to also pursuing those issues in my own work in the coming months and to providing an update in the next 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you for providing this update on your latest dialogue. I'm Adil Sultan. I am from War Studies Department, King's College, London. Thank you, Jack, for offering Pakistani perspective, but I think it would have been better if somebody from Pakistan would have been here at the forum to really deliberate on some of the issues, because the central theme out of all the of Trump's statements or the commentary that followed was that Pakistan's to do more to control its militants. Thank you very much, but we all worked very hard to create this mess for the last 40 years. So don't expect Pakistan that it can be done or resolve this issue within few years. Some of the issues, Jack, you have highlighted, but I think we all understand who is the principal beneficiary of this peace process or the stability in Afghanistan. Of course, in Pakistan, and I don't need to go into figures that we have suffered more than 60,000 casualties and military personnel also in terms of economic losses also. So if Afghanistan is stabilized, Pakistan would be the primary beneficiary of this. The Pakistani concern from this whole debate, and you have heard Pakistani officials and you must have heard at the conference also, that India's role in Afghanistan would be to destabilize Pakistan. And why these concerns emerged? Because then once the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval clearly says that we can bleed Pakistan by using this Afghan insurgency in Balochistan. And last week, I think one of the senior Indian politicians also made a prophecy that by March or April 2018, Pakistan would start disintegrate with the Indian support. That was a very irresponsible statement. I don't take it seriously, but that also indicates the intent.
Other is a question. Just want to ask.
Like
a question.
you said,
a comment.
we can
But
make a comment also.
But others have asked also to speak.
Yeah, sure, I will, because it was more or less about Pakistan, so that's why I'm saying about it. From the Trump statement, I think three conclusions one can draw. It was intended to build India's image as a regional power by legitimizing, as Rahul said, by legitimizing its role in Afghanistan. Second was to impede the CPAC process by encouraging India to create trouble in that region. And it was also, Secretary of Defense Matters, he said that CPAC runs through a disputed territory. So this was very strange, because in 1960, US helped Pakistan to build a water reservoir in the same area, but it was never a concern at that time. And lastly, to keep Pakistan's nuclear weapons program under pressure, because this statement was about Afghanistan. This mentioning of nuclear weapons, it was uncalled for. So one can make out, so what are the main themes from this statement? Thank you.
Victoria Schofield.
Thank you. I'm Victoria Schofield, independent writer on the region. One of the aspects of President Trump's speech also was highlighting the mineral reserves in Afghanistan and the rare elements, which, of course, as we know, have lain under Afghanistan soil. The Russians, Soviets, during their occupation, did a very detailed survey. None of you mentioned this as an aspect of the US's continuing presence. John, you talked about a decade, requiring a decade or more of effort. Do you think within that decade there's going to be any possibility of optimizing American economic interests in Afghanistan in pursuit of the minerals which are in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Let me take, the gentleman here, and then we'll come to the next round after I go back to the panelists. So we have three questions. Yes, please. If you could identify yourself.
Thank you. Andreas Benke, University of Reading, and a member of the Svein Institute. I guess my question goes to the Americans on the panel. WETA, PBS just broadcast a 10-part series on the Vietnam War, if you allow me to extend the historical horizon a little bit. An exit with honor, dumping hardware on the regime there, demanding that they get their act together. How is this not another case of Vietnamization? How is this not what the French in their racist language call the jeunification or yellowification there? Is this not the same protracted and painful exit like we experienced in the 70s? If you could put this in this larger context.
Thank you. Let's come back to the panel. Jack, do you want to sort of respond to Adil, and then we can respond to the other question?
Sure. I guess I'm very familiar with the Pakistani concerns, and you've outlined them very concisely. And certainly, as I mentioned, one cannot agree more that Pakistan would be the principal beneficiary from stability in Afghanistan. And I've certainly heard that from many Pakistanis, which for Americans as outside observers, not again speaking on my own behalf, leads one to be mystified by some of Pakistan's actions. I think, though, in reference to the speech of 21 August, there's no reference to, in the speech, to encouraging, there's no reference to CPEC at all or China at all, and I don't think there's any reference to encouraging India to be a troublemaker or cause problems for Pakistan or anyone else. And then secondly, specifically in reference to the Pakistan nuclear program, the speech is intended to outline a regional strategy. And if you will recall, over the past 15, 16 years, America has been criticized quite often for not having a regional approach and looking at Afghanistan as if it were an island in the middle of the ocean somewhere, or only at Afghanistan and Pakistan, or only looking at Pakistan through an Afghan prism. So guessing, since I didn't write the speech, it would seem to me that this is clearly an effort to broaden and make a real regional policy that previously the U.S. has been criticized for not pursuing. So that includes things like India-Pakistan tensions, and American concerns about Pakistan's nuclear program are well known. None of the things that the president said in his speech were new in that regard. So I think that's why it's brought into this speech, because it was not specifically only on Afghanistan, but to try and look at Afghanistan more and to look at a more regional context.
Yeah, I'll talk very, very briefly about. So here's the speech right here. No CPEC, nothing about minerals in here at all.
You talked about bringing the treasure back, the investments America had made.
Right. No mention of mineral wealth. Okay, so this highlights the point that I made earlier, and not to really poke you back here, but look at what is actually said. Now, he did make a tweet later, I think, something about minerals or whatever. But in my mind, and living in Washington, I've tried to steel myself into not assuming that tweets equal policy. And so I'd offer that up to you as well. A friend of mine once told me, this was probably 8 or 9 years ago when I was working on U.S. policy. He said, the Sudan will host the Winter Olympics before $1 billion worth of minerals comes out of Afghanistan. I think he's probably right. The fact that they are there is very interesting. The fact that they are there is a great opportunity, but being able to mine them is one thing. Being able to extract them out of the ground and process them is another thing. Being able to transport any of it out of the country is a third issue. And so it's aspirational. It's aspirational in much the same way that CPEC is somewhat aspirational. The region won't benefit from the true value of CPEC for 40 or 50 years, nor will the Chinese nor the Pakistanis recoup any of their investment probably until that horizon. So is it worthy of pursuing? Absolutely. Is it something that's going to be transformative in the near term? Probably not, but don't make that near-term challenge put off the possibilities of long-term benefit. We just need to be clear-eyed on it, and we need to read what's actually in the policy statements, right? Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, it's on. Okay. Good. Yeah, just a quick follow-up on the issue of the minerals, rare earth, because this is actually something, and the Soviet report actually even underestimated what was there. There's sort of a sense that it's even upwards of $1 trillion. I think it's $980 million or $1 billion worth of minerals. John is absolutely right. It's actually valueless if it does not get out of the ground. Right now, companies that are engaged in it tend to be, I would say, more regionally based. In fact, I'd love to hear Antoine's view of if the Chinese are looking at really intensifying their activity. They were one of the first to stake a claim on some of the deposits, India as well. But the biggest issue, and without question, the hurdle that needs to be overcome is transiting it out of the territory. From the U.S. perspective, and you're seeing this increasingly, not just in Afghanistan, but in the broader region, the private sector will go in if it's profitable. It won't if it's not. The U.S. government is not going to force companies in there, and I think this is a pretty clear statement. Business councils that work in the region, and I would say particularly with Afghanistan, are vexed with, they want to bring in and draw in American companies but can't. And so until the security situation changes, I do fear that it may take a while. And we may see what the Sudan hosts the Winter Olympics. On the question on the Vietnam syndrome, and I wanted to hit this one because it's an excellent one. It's also a wonderful series. Put in a plug for PBS and Ken Burns. Oh, and BBC as well. Okay, yeah. It's a no. I mean, it definitely. One can continue to draw parallels of countries that get involved in wars and then withdraw. You try to frame the ending of it. Who decides to set up what this narrative is going to look like. I mean, first of all countries do that with conflicts. Comparing Vietnam to Afghanistan, we're looking at a different situation. Cold War, non-Cold War. This one is a multinational effort, actually, on the part of not just the U.S., but let's not forget NATO forces, other partner states, as well as the Afghan government. My bigger worry is that I keep hoping we don't go down the Somalia path, where we have a conflict and then we realize it's just too difficult and we get out and forget about it, where it's simply ignored. That was the concern in the late 80s for Afghanistan, and I still am I'm one of those that I think we need to keep reminding ourselves to stay engaged. And I do think these other ways to engage diplomatically, economically, and through regional organizations, and we need to highlight this, both the previous administration and the current one, believe it or not, are looking at, if other organizations, other states get involved, that's not a bad thing. And I think that's an issue that perhaps has changed from U.S. policy during the Cold War, where we tended to think of it in terms of us versus them. I think here there's a sense, quite frankly, if U.S. participation or U.S. engagement in Afghanistan is to drop, it's because other states are actually picking up the effort. And so, again, this is perhaps aspirational. My hope is we don't go down this path. And I don't think we are, because some of the basic conditions are a bit different.
Can I get just a two-finger on that as well? I think it's a great question, but I also think that when we look back at the history, we tend to look at what are the things that are the same, or the kinds of indicators that are the same. We also have to pay attention to what are the things that are different. And I'll give you one big difference. The National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, wrote a doctoral dissertation about how to screw up the Vietnam War. He is a smart enough man that he knows that his performance as the National Security Advisor is in many circles being judged through the lens of his criticism of Vietnam. And so if there's one person in all of Washington so keenly aware of the need to avoid the parallels with Vietnam, I can think of no one that's more keenly aware of that than H.R. McMaster.
How long is it going to be in
That's fine. That's fine.
The other thing I think it's useful to point out here, and there's certainly a lot to learn from history. Having pretensions to being an historian myself, I value history. But the other key piece here is, remember, South Vietnam fell because of nation-state invasion. Hundreds of thousands of regular North Vietnamese troops with tanks, artillery, and air support drove south and defeated South Vietnam. We do not face that in the situation in Afghanistan. Is there a devilish insurgency? Absolutely. Is it really hard? Yes. But there is not a nation state that is going to be driving through Afghanistan with tanks and air support.
Antoine, briefly.
Just a quick point on the CPEC, Adil. Notwithstanding the comment which Secretary Mattis may have made, I think the question is whether that's a factor in policy making, and my sense is, but so far it is not. So it's not reflective of something as deep as would be required for engaging a real policy. For what I understand, the current mood in the region is quite well disposed to enhancing connectivity, and of course CPEC has a proposition built in itself to really provide some of the really essential connectivity which the region is lacking. My own sense is that really the concerns there are over CPEC are of a non-security nature, with the exception of India. Issues around transparency, issues around distortions of Pakistan's private sector, issues around Pakistan's ability to sustain debt levels implied by CPEC. But I would offer those points in moderation to yours. And finally, on Roger's point, I don't think I've seen anything in recent times suggesting rekindling of interest from the Chinese side on mining in that respect.
Thank you. Briefly, before I turn again to the floor for questions, I think in terms of trying to interpret Indian policy, official policy, there are all sorts of politicians and all sorts of people out there. I think we should just be careful to see how important or influential they are in terms of what they say, and more important, of what actually they do and what the government does. But let me turn to the next round, and I see Tim Wilsey, and then we have two other people, three other people. So Tim first, please.
I'm Tim Wilsey, former British diplomat, now with King's College and Chatham House. Can you tell us a bit about your thoughts about what Russia... Okay. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think Russia is up to? I mean, apparently have a channel open to the Taliban, allegations that they're actually arming the Taliban. What's all this about, and how much threat does this pose to the US strategy?
Desmond Bowen, please. The mic is coming, Desmond.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a member here. I mean, the big change, it seems to me, in the Trump announcement is that the time limitation is off, and therefore a political settlement is required in order to bring this issue to a close. Where I think there is complete lack of clarity is what reconciliation means. What does a political settlement, what are the contours of it? And I just wonder whether anybody can throw light on what reconciliation might mean, and whether there is a coming together, not just of, say, America and the Afghans, but of regional powers as well.
Thank you. Yes, Kiran, Dr. Kiran.
Thank you so much. Kiran Hassan, independent analyst. My question is regarding, it's an ongoing question that has already been asked by Tim. This is the Russian engagement within the region, because we've seen recently that there has been defense exercises between the Russian military and the Pakistani military. That is a new evolution. So that there seems to be a much more of a Russian involvement within the region. And of course, the other one is regarding China, because there has been a larger economic as well as social footprint increasingly. I mean, CPEC may not, as Antoine has said, may not have that kind of presence in the official presentations and so on and so forth. But apart from other things, I mean, CPEC has been very, it's a larger kind of like theme within Pakistan and China, and that also resonates with Rahul's point on Chabahar port. So I'm more interested in the Russian and the Chinese involvement within this region. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn back to the panel, and then we'll have another round of questions or comments. Who wants to start first? Russia, I think, Tim.
Do the Russia, yeah. I mean, both, and I'll sort of hit on both of these points, and I'll do it, try to do it quickly on this. My comments initially, just sort of this basic, in terms of their view of the Trump strategy, supportive because, quite frankly, and this is borne out not just in official documents, but in their sort of analytical work, and in a recent study done out of Moscow this past week. Believe it or not, they really are concerned about transnational threats, extremism, narcotics trafficking, etc., emanating from Afghanistan. In some ways, they still hold a 1980s, 1990s view of Afghanistan. Some, others, perhaps are a little more forward-thinking on this. But the ability to control it or manage it is a concern. And how do you do that? You do engage with regional partners and with regional security structures. For Russia, their border southward is not the Russian-Kazakh border, but it really is the border with Afghanistan. I mean, in some ways, this is seen as a concern, and so hence they'll engage some of their partners with the Central Asian states and others. That said, with respect to U.S. actions, and I would say that there is this notion of not just a zero-sum mindset, but a sense that the U.S. is looking at this in a broader, holistic fashion, that our engagement in Afghanistan, our engagement with or against Iran, in Syria, in the Caucasus, with the broader NATO alliance, with Ukraine, the Korean Peninsula, somehow all of these actions are linked together in some broader scope of containing and or managing Russia. Couldn't be further from the truth, to be honest. Conspiracy theories are great. That would make a wonderful movie, but it's simply not true. These are separate actions that have their own security challenges, threats, concerns, and sort of analyses that go into them. But by framing it this way, one, you start to instrumentalize Afghanistan and you look at it as a playground for some broader competition. And secondly, it I think plays into a more sinister view of how we look at geopolitics. And I do worry that this has come up. So when we think in terms of Russian engagement, this does mean that there are certain elements that say, well, we can engage in the country if it will hurt the Americans. We can now. Is there support for negotiations for the Taliban? This is something I'm actually a little bit of a skeptic on it. There are Russian goods and support in the region that gets hijacked, that gets exploited and extorted by Taliban forces, as from other countries, and so I don't want to read too much into that. I know there was a recent piece in the Times about this. There's also, but I would say that a sense of if there are ways which they can create problems for the U.S., that's good to an extent, but let's not forget, if the U.S. fails in Afghanistan, if that's the end state, that end state is not good for Russia. The Russian national security strategy does not want to see a failed state in Afghanistan. So meddling with, perhaps making it difficult for the Americans, yes. Making us fail, no. And with respect to their exercises with Pakistan, I'll actually turn to Jack more on that one. But I would say it's a good symbolic gesture in the region. Russia does a fantastic job of what I call low-cost, high-yield efforts. That is, it's a low financial cost, but it plays well, and I think that is actually one. But I'll turn to Jack if he wants to offer a clearer thought on this.
Okay, then let me ask John to respond to Desmond's very focused question.
I don't want to sound like a bumper sticker, but I can't think of any better way to phrase it other than this. The United States, I believe, is very firmly committed to the reconciliation process being an Afghan process. And I would offer that my personal experience in the past is that we said that and probably didn't really mean it as much as we probably should have. In other words, if the Afghans want to loosen the rules, then that's an Afghan decision. But it has to be a loosening of the rules, so to speak, in a way that the rest of the regional actors don't become spoilers to the process. So while it's an Afghan process, Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, whatever the rest of the trite phrase is, it's Afghan-owned and Afghan process that has to stand up within the regional context. So along those lines, I think that what some of the reconciliation means is that clearly there's a renouncing of the violence, but in order to get there, that might require ultimately the Afghans themselves to modify or change their form of government, which gets us down a whole other discussion about parliamentary versus the presidential power, the current constitution versus some revised future constitution. I think all of these things are areas that we have to be willing to allow the Afghans to go about pursuing in order to get to this end state. It also means it's not going to happen very quickly. Secondly, the reconciliation needs to facilitate peace in the broader region, and by that it means that there have to be some enticements that result in certain actors swearing that they're not going to use the so-called peace to come in Afghanistan as a launching pad to do bad things in other places throughout the broader region. And then I believe that the United States government wants to see all of this to help facilitate greater, broader regional economic integration, because that benefits the stability and the pursuit of stability and peace in Afghanistan, but it also builds the situation for the entire region. Two, there are no set preconditions by the United States for the talks themselves. And this is an area that I think is frequently misunderstood. The mixing of what the United States would like to see as the ultimate outcome as being some kind of precondition for the talks to occur themselves. And I believe we heard over this past weekend a reaffirmation of that statement from the U.S. officials that there are, in fact, no preconditions to the beginning of the talks or to the continuance of the talks. And then finally, I'd say that in order to facilitate all this, we need to see a meaningful shift and the meaningful actions on the ground. So that means that if the Taliban want to pursue peace, and if the Afghan government and the Afghan representatives want to embrace the Taliban, it has to be in such a way that the Afghan Taliban really do want to become part of the political process and set aside being extremists. You can't have, as we've seen elsewhere in the region, efforts to try to cloak an extremist ideology and methodology in a political party's clothing and think that that allows you to be both extremist and political players at the same time. I think that would be an area where we would very strongly encourage our Afghans Afghan partners not to embrace that as the outcome.
Antoine, briefly.
Thank you. Dr. Hassan on CPEC. A few points. I mean, I intentionally did not mention this because it is not the purpose of this particular discussion, but obviously CPEC is extremely relevant to the future of Pakistan and indeed of greater South Asia and possibly even Southern Asia, as I tend to call it. There's no doubt in my mind that it's a game changer for Pakistan. There's no doubt in my mind at all. Last week we heard, I think in the last 10 days, we heard a very major speech from the Pakistan Army Chief, General Bajwa, about the economy, and this had a lot of references to CPEC. It's also clear in my mind that a number of countries support CPEC besides the US, the UK being another. And finally, there's no doubt in my mind also that there's more research which needs to be conducted on the issue. How China and Pakistan respectively are organizing and implementing their own due diligence of the projects and how they see those in the long term, I think is of crucial importance, and it's an area which has been so far understudied and which I intend to play a part in.
Thank you. We go to the last round. I've got two people. I've got three. Okay. The lady there, yes, please. If you identify yourself.
Lizzie Hobbs, a master's student at King's. Quite a lot of the literature kind of cites the post-conflict dialogue for kind of shaping EU and Pakistan kind of stance towards refugees, and the large numbers of pushbacks there were for kind of creating the crisis of IDPs. Kind of wondered if more American troop involvement or a change in Pakistan's stance is likely to make any difference to the kind of stance of governments towards Afghan refugees.
Thank you. Ethirajan Anbarasan, BBC.
Hi, I'm Anbarasan from the BBC. You know, it's broadly speaking about the global reaction to the strategy and thinking about the regional actors. One concern for many Afghans or many in the government is about the fencing along the Pakistan-Afghan border. It started in some areas, and they're very concerned that this will legitimize the border, the Durand line, even though many Afghans do not accept it. They're afraid that, you know, the Pashtun heartland, where people can move freely, and it will be really make it difficult for these communities because they have, you know, lots of this matrimonial links, relations. But is that being taken into consideration about Afghans' concern about this border fencing? Many clashes have happened in the last few years.
Thank you. Adam Gibson.
Hi, Adam Gibson, work here at IISS. Thanks for your speeches today. The one thing that I've taken away from it is that Pakistan seems to find itself between a rock and a hard place. It has Trump on one side and China on the other. My question would be, where do you see Pakistan aligning itself in the coming months and years? Would it be with Trump or would it be with China? Because assuming that if they align with one, it alienates itself from the other.
Thank you. That's sort of a good question to end on. Let's start maybe in reverse order, unless someone wants to jump in for the three questions. Do you want to?
If I come in on your question, Adam, my own sense is that any country will have fundamental national interests, and that those national interests will guide long-term policy outlook and even short-term policy decisions at times. And I don't think that it's been considered to be in Pakistan's national interest to side wholly and entirely with any country. I think there's a tradition in Pakistan of relating more than cordially to a number of countries and a number of powerful ones, and I don't think that this is likely to end anytime soon. There are, however, some interesting dynamics at play, whereby CPEC, particularly if it bears the entirety of its promised fruits, will structurally reorient elements of Pakistan's economy towards a greater relationship with China, and this will have inevitable 1-2 generation away consequences on the outlook of the country and its elites.
Thank you. There wasn't anything specific to India, so let me just move to Jack Gill.
Yeah, just very quickly in response to the last question. I think it's kind of a false dichotomy, and I would echo what Antoine said about Pakistan not having to choose yes A and not B, or yes B and not A, that it will balance its foreign policy insofar as possible. So I don't think it's likely that there will be it's not a Cold War, and we certainly would not wish to go back to that kind of 1950s, 60s sort of framework of thinking about things. But I would not want to underestimate the frictions now or potential in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. That those are real and they're serious, and both sides have talked about how they want to address those and try to overcome them. And we'll have to see. The U.S. is going to be looking for actions on Pakistan's side. Pakistan is going to have expectations of the United States. So we'll have to see how those play out in the coming weeks and months.
Okay. To be just to clarify, the question on the refugees in Afghanistan, it's simply the U.S. position on, or how do we see in terms of their returning, and how does this even affect our overall policy? I think right now what you're seeing, and partly one can still fall back on the, I would say the last moments of, you can use the line, it's too early to tell, in the sense of there's no real clear policy on this. Obviously, with certain instances, the notion of refugees coming to the U.S., this has become a very political issue, but it generally relates to countries farther to the west, not to Afghanistan itself. I think the general principle, and this actually goes back now 2 administrations, of as soon as one sees a more peaceful, stable Afghanistan, at least the hope, and maybe it's just simply a reflexive view, is that these refugees in both Pakistan, and let's be clear, there are also refugees in Iran, would find their way back. But this is part of a broader geopolitical situation. I know from the European view, we're seeing these refugees actually not going back home, but moving in another direction. That's actually not been part of the U.S. discourse right now. And so, unfortunately, the answer to your question is there really isn't an answer at present in terms of how it's shaping our views. But if someone wants to correct me, happy to hear that. But I've not really seen much discussion on this, unfortunately.
Sure, well, the only person who can correct you in this panel is the last John.
I'm not sure I want to be in the business of correcting anybody, but here's one of the dilemmas with the Afghan refugee situation. The Afghan refugee situation existed for 35 years, and therefore there's a certain amount of I don't know. When I was in the Army, we used to say that if you see something, you're walking through the motor pool and you see something that's wrong, you've got to go correct it right then. Because the first day you walk past it, you say, that really looks wrong. And then the second day you walk past it, you say, that doesn't quite look right. And the third day that you walk past it, you say, I know that there's something odd about this, but I'm really not sure what I want to do about it. By the 4th or 5th day, you don't even notice it, right? It just has become part of it. The first thing I wrote down was Rohingya. There's a greater likelihood that the United States and the broader international community will take action in Myanmar and Bangladesh on a refugee crisis than there is with dealing with the 35-plus-year-old situation in Afghanistan. And there's a lot behind that, and so therefore I think it falls into that category of really hard and might not be resolved until after the actual reconciliation occurs. And I've already told you I think that's got another decade down the road.
Can I add a comment before you turn to fencing?
Sure.
On the refugees, it's useful to keep in mind that the timeline that John has outlined. Okay, so that there were thousands upon thousands of these refugees, which is a useful term, and certainly it's been a burden on Pakistan, burden on Iran, but thousands upon thousands of them who were born in Pakistan or in Iran, not in Afghanistan. So when people talk about them going back, they've never been to go back to. So they have no village that they can go back to in Kandahar or Helmand or Uruzgan. So this poses an additional challenge for finding a way to deal with this problem. And it's a major issue for Pakistan. It's a major issue for Afghanistan. They talk about it all the time. But sadly, we see no sort of resolution in the immediate offing, and the UN is worked very hard on this, but there are a lot of challenges where people try to take advantage of UN donations, et cetera. So it's a really big issue, but I want to point out this. If you were born 20 years ago or 25 years ago in Pakistan, you have no, yes, your granddad may have come from Mazar-e Sharif, but you've never been there. So it's a real issue.
Regarding the fencing on the PAC-AF border and the implication that it might legitimize the Durand line, good luck. First of all, it's a terribly complex border. Number one. Number two, I think that despite the really outstanding efforts in a lot of ways, and here I must be very complimentary of Pakistan. I think they've done everything that they could reasonably do to try to picket the border. But it is exactly what I said, a tremendously complex border, the terrain, but also the politics and also the economics. And I was just reading earlier this morning a report about from Afghan Analyst Network, which I would highly commend, that talks about just exactly how do the Taliban keep commuting, and that's the word they use, commuting across the Afghan-Pakistan border. And they go into great detail, and included in that report is a recently declassified 1981 CIA report about just how terribly difficult it is to control the Afghan-Pakistan border. And much of what it references are exactly the same conditions that both sides face today. So will it legitimize the Durand line? It will for those who want it to legitimize the Durand line, and for those of who don't really care about the Durand line, I don't think that it will. A colleague and a good friend, former ambassador of the United States to Afghanistan, wrote a really interesting article about 5 or 6 years ago called Borderline Insanity. And one of the things that he very stridently recommended was for the Afghan government to get over this whole Durand line thing and to come to realization that much of the rest of the world, in fact probably the entire rest of the world, recognizes that as the international boundary, and that issue should just be taken off the table. I know there's a lot of history of that. Don't need to get into it with everybody, but I think he happens to be right. And then finally, this argument about Pakistan being between a rock and a hard place. I'm hesitant. I agree with Jack. I don't think that, and Antoine, who said, nations pursue their interests and it doesn't put them between one or the other. But the nature of the question itself, I think, highlights one of the great challenges all of us face in the region. And that is this overwhelming propensity to look at things in a zero-sum format. We can, in fact, be friends with Pakistan and India at the same time. We are not preferring one over the other. We can, in fact, disagree strongly with the Chinese about what they're doing in the South China Sea and be fully supportive of fuller economic integration of South Asia via the CPEC. Right? So this idea that nations have to choose one or the other, that it's all black and white, zero sum, I think is very easy, and it's lazy in some respects, and it does not reflect how the real world operates. And so we ought to be, as an American might say, able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so I think that might be asking for a lot sometimes, but I would hope that that's what guides us in the future, and not some narrow-minded little sheet where we're keeping tally about who scored what on what day on what side, and therefore, one side over the other is preferred. The world's far more complicated than that, and I think we should rise to that challenge and be willing to find answers that realize those degrees of complication.
Thank you very much. On that note, we must end. We've just passed our allocated time, but before we do so, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel for the discussion, and thank you also for the questions that you put to us. So thank you.